Dear beloved community, a warm welcome to each of you on this, the 13th day of June in the year 2021. Here in Mountain Spring, winter has definitely come. We experienced some sleet the other day and there was snow just slightly up the road. It's really been a weather change. It's hard to believe how quickly the year is moving. I hope each of you is well and happy and safe wherever you might be. The last few days I've been thinking about three qualities that we speak of a lot in Zen Buddhism. Three qualities that make up a rich, a deep, and an authentic practice. The first quality is a quality that we call great confidence or great faith. And this means finally acknowledging to yourself that you have the capacity to wake up, that you can do this, that you have the seed of Buddha nature within you. At the same time, this great confidence, great faith is acknowledging that every other person, every other living being has this capacity also. This is not something superficial, something idealistic. In fact, this realization rocks you to your core. We're so convinced of our own inadequacy, and we find ways to have this confirmed for us constantly. With this doorway, this gateway of practice, the gateway of great confidence, we acknowledge to ourselves our innate goodness and our innate capacity. And also all of the ways that we close off towards it. We understand that meditation practice is about uncovering that which has been there all along. The second doorway of authentic or deep or rich practice is called great doubt. Notice that this is great doubt, not small or cynical doubt. One way to approach this quality of great doubt in the practice is to understand that it's the wholehearted capacity to not settle. To not settle in any one place, thinking that it's the ultimate, but to be willing to let go over and over again. Even of the insights that we think are great or deep or the ultimate insight. To be willing to let go over and over again so that the new growth can spring forth. In the Zen world, particularly in Japanese Zen, one of the first koans that's offered to students is based on the story of when a student came to Master Jojo and asked him, "Does a dog have a Buddha nature?" Master Jojo looked at the student and said, "No." I like to imagine the look on this student's face, since it's a fundamental and core teaching of Buddhism that every single living being has this innate seed of goodness. But here, Master Jojo cut out the foundation from under the student. Perhaps one reason might be that, as Tay has shared with us so many times, often our idea of something can prevent us from touching its reality. In the Book of Eights, the Atthakavagga, we've been reminded that all views, every single view, is a wrong view. And any view we have will at best only be partial. Here in this koan, the student came to Master Jojo and basically asked him to confirm his conceptual viewpoint. Master Jojo was an amazing teacher. And so, as any good teacher would do, he challenged the student into deeper growth, rather than allowing that student to remain stagnant. I think this is an important thing for us to consider. Do we want to have a teacher or a teaching that just confirms everything that we think we know? If so, how on earth do we expect to grow? Our idea of something can prevent us from touching the reality. If you've generated the capacity of great confidence, then naturally this sense of, am I sure? And if I'm sure, I'll check again, will arise. If not, there's no growth. The third doorway or gateway or aspect of a rich practice is called great practice, or sometimes great determination. Sometimes the two go together. This is the capacity to just keep going. In this quality, in this gateway, in this essence of the practice, I often think of the old maxim, I don't know what my path is, but I'm walking it. Or sometimes the image that's given in the texts of a person who once every so often climbs up to the top of the mountain and brushes a silk cloth lightly over a rock on the top of the mountain, knowing that eventually this will wear away the mountain. This is the doorway of, there's no reason that I can't do what others have done. I'll keep going. In this week's poem, which is the second last poem in the Book of Eights, we just have one more to reflect on. The Buddha speaks of the sense of urgency that led him to leave behind the comforts of his everyday life, his household life. This sense of urgency in Pali is called samvega and can mean distress from seeing our real situation and the situation of the world around. If we really see our situation, if we really see and we touch our suffering, and we recognize how these cycles repeat over and over again, if we have an insight into impermanence, then this feeling of samvega, distress, urgency to understand arises. And it can be a powerful motivator for our practice. Looking at tonight's poem as a whole, the first 5 verses of this poem express this experience of distress, of despair, of urgency, samvega. And the remaining verses share with us how to go about uprooting what the Buddha calls the arrow or the thorn within our heart. There's something that I find very special and poignant about this poem. There's a vulnerability in the Buddha's sharing about samvega. So often in the later texts, the Buddha is deified, raised up to the level of someone that's almost divine. But here we have the Buddha speaking about his distress. It's a reminder that Buddhism is not a path without emotion. The title of this week's poem can be translated as arming oneself, or taking up the stick, or violent conduct. The first line of the poem is like a thunderbolt. It's a really strong line. We usually think that the best way to prevent self-injury is to arm ourselves to the hilt. I need to protect myself more. But the Buddha invites us to observe how, in a strange way, arming ourselves to the hilt often ends up contributing to cycles of more fear. The latter half of the poem describes how to cultivate a state of mind, a stance within unfolding experience that avoids the somewhat dysfunctional move of creating and projecting ourselves in every situation. These few verses embrace the whole of the Four Noble Truths, the suffering manifest as violence, caused by the thorn in each of our hearts, the unbinding or the crossing over this, and the way to cultivate the letting go of selfing that is a hallmark of liberation, of true freedom. But funnily enough, most of the training that's mentioned in this poem is training in what to let go of, training in what not to do. The only one thing that's mentioned in this poem as being important to take up, to do, is truthfulness. And we've spoken about truthfulness being a hallmark of the path in earlier talks. So the poem begins Fear is born from arming yourself. Or it can be translated, fear is born from taking up the rod of violence. Just see how many people fight. I'll tell you about the dreadful fear that caused me to shake all over. As we've discovered in our Metta Sutta class, the class on the Discourse on love, fear is a manifestation of ill will. Ill will is one of the deepest unhelpful roots in our consciousness, and it spans the whole spectrum from hatred to a subtle closing down of the heart. Here in this verse, we're reminded of the teaching that it's through arming ourselves to the hilt, of closing down, that fear is actually born. The best way of protecting ourselves in the view of the Buddha is not through closing down, but through the cultivation of metta. Metta, loving kindness, is seen as a protective force. The poem continues, seeing creatures, seeing living beings flopping around like fish in water too shallow, so hostile to each other. Seeing this, I became afraid. The rod of violence referred to in the first verse takes three forms. Physical violence, which are the three forms of bodily misconduct. Verbal violence, which are the four forms of verbal misconduct. And mental violence, the three forms of mental misconduct. For those of you like me who are list lovers, get ready. Here's a list of these different forms of verbal and mental misconduct. So in the Kunda Karaputta Sutta, which you can find in the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 10, sutra number 176, we read the following. And how is one engaged in the three forms of unskillful bodily action? There is the case where a certain person takes life, showing no mercy to living beings. They take what is not given. They take in the manner of a thief things in a village or a wilderness that belong to others and have not been given by them. They engage in sensual misconduct. This is how one engages in three ways in unskillful bodily action. And how does one engage in four ways in unskillful verbal action? There is the case where a person engages in false speech, when he's been called to a town meeting, a group meeting, a gathering of their relatives or of the royalty. If they're asked as a witness, come and tell us what you know. If he doesn't know, he says, I know. If she does know, she says, I don't know. If he hasn't seen, he says, I have seen. If she has seen, she says, I haven't seen. Thus she consciously tells lies for her own sake, for the sake of another, or for the sake of a certain reward. She engages in divisive speech. What has been heard here, she tells there, to break apart those people from the people around them. What he has heard there, he tells here, to break people apart from those people nearby. Thus breaking apart those who are united and stirring up strife between those who have been broken apart. He loves factionalism, delights in factionalism, enjoys factionalism, speaks things that create factionalism. She engages in abusive speech. She speaks words that are harsh, that are cutting, that are bitter to others, abusive of others, provoking anger and destroying concentration. He engages in idle chatter. He speaks out of season, speaks what is not factual, what isn't in accordance with the goal of liberation, the Dharma and the mindfulness trainings, words that are not worth treasuring. This is how one is made impure in four ways by unskillful verbal action and unskillful mental action. And how is one engaged in three forms of unskillful mental action? There is the case where a certain person is covetous. She covets the belongings of others, thinking, oh, I wish that what belonged to others would be mine. He bears ill will, corrupt in the resolves of his heart. May these beings be killed or cut apart or crushed or destroyed. May they not exist at all. He has wrong view, is warped in the way he sees things. There's nothing given, nothing offered, nothing sacrificed. There's no fruit or result of good or bad actions. There's no world, no next world, no mother, no father, no wise ones, no real practitioners who have directly known and realized for themselves. This is how one engages in 3 ways in unskillful mental action. Let's enjoy a sound of the bell. So in this verse, we also read the line, seeing creatures, seeing living beings flopping around like fish in a fast drying lake. This image is a reminder of the image that we encountered early in our reflections on the Book of Eights, the image of a fish in a puddle, and reminds us of the sense of urgency and dismay that the Buddha felt about our collective situation, and that he shares is a wonderful quality of the practice. The poem continues, this world completely lacks essence. It trembles in all directions. I longed to find myself a place unscathed, but I could not see it. Sometimes people come to the monastery and at the end of a day of mindfulness or a retreat, they'll say, right, it's now time for me to go back to the real world. I wonder why they think that the way that society lives is the real world, and the way that we live in a practice center is the unreal world. We've made a choice to live this way. You make a choice each and every moment to live that way. The Buddha here is reminding us of one of the central teachings in Mahayana Buddhism, and that is the teaching of Shunyata, of emptiness or interbeing. The Buddha is also reminding us that looking around in all directions, he was unable to find a place of safety outside of himself. Seeing people locked in conflict, I became completely distraught. But then I discerned here a thorn, hard to see, lodged deep in the heart. So the word distraught here is a translation of the word samvega, distress or dismay, at seeing the real situation of suffering. A little bit like in the movie The Matrix, when Neo takes the pill and finally, in the context of the movie, sees things for what they really are. The Buddha describes this feeling of samvega, urgency, distress, dismay at these repeating cycles of suffering as an important feeling that can be food for the path if we know how to channel it well, to not just continue these cycles and to continue wasting our time, but to focus on what's most important, to focus on what we need to transform and to be able to direct our attentions to that. The verse that we just read, seeing people locked in conflict, I became completely distraught, and so on, is a unique verse in the Pali Canon. It's not repeated anywhere. And it gives us this sense of the Buddha as experiencing this deep vulnerability that many of us have experienced as practitioners and as human beings. And it's a lovely verse to read and to reflect on. It reminds us that the Buddha's experience was not so different from our own, that it is possible for us too to wake up, that the Buddha is someone who's not so distant after all. The Buddha's insight was that each one of us has a thorn, an arrow in our own hearts, which is the root cause of our situation. We usually have the tendency to focus mainly on the externals. The Buddha's insight was that the external and the internal mirror each other in so many ways. The Buddha's insight is an empowering one. The Buddha recognized that it was possible for him, and at the same time it's possible for each one of us and every living being to remove this thorn. It's not only possible, but the Buddha's insight is that it's necessary. And the poem continues, "It's only when pierced by this thorn that one runs in all directions. So if that thorn is taken out, one does not run and settles down." So here we have a reminder of our human tendency to run after everything that we think will even momentarily take away this pain, this grief, this despair. This is our usual situation and our usual habit energy, our usual entrenchment, to use the phrase in the Book of Eights. But just as the Buddha says, these brief moments, by their very nature, can't last, and our situation remains the same, if not a little bit more entrenched, because the water is reducing down. Buddhist practice is not the practice of avoidance, but rather developing the willingness and the capacity to show up for what is. Tay has reminded us so many times of this in his teaching, "The way out is through." Another meaning of this line, "one doesn't run," is that one doesn't run to any of the destinations of rebirth. And we've already discovered that jati, birth, is not only physical rebirth, but birth in each and every moment. What's coming to be, what's arising, what's remaining for a period of time, and what's passing away in any moment within us. That one doesn't sink into any of the four floods of sensual desires, the flood of views, the flood of becoming, or the flood of ignorance. I've spoken so many times previously of the metaphor that's often used to describe Buddhist practice, the image of a shore of suffering and a shore of liberation, and our practice of crossing over the flood or the four floods. The four floods that we just mentioned are the flood of views, the flood of our tendency towards being drawn into attraction or aversion regarding sensory contact, the sounds we hear, the smells we have, the tastes, the sights, the sensations of our body and the thoughts, and, for example, or our tendency to want to become something, and our tendency towards confusion or ignorance. As we continue on with the poem, in the original text, we come to an interesting line that seems really out of place. It says, "And here the trainings are recited." So we've had this beautiful beginning of the poem in which we've touched the vulnerability of the Buddha. We've touched the Buddha's experience on a heart level of when he saw this situation of samsara, these repeating cycles of suffering, and he shared about this dismay that he felt, that shook him to his core. And then we have this line, "And here the trainings are recited." So this phrase, which some scholars tell us was probably added a bit later, is kind of like a stage direction, and it seems to indicate that this poem was used in early Buddhist communities as part of the precepts recitation, which is an interesting thing to contemplate, that this poem would be part of a mindfulness training's recitation. So the poem continues, "Whatever things are tied down in the world, you shouldn't be set on them. Having totally penetrated sensual pleasures, sensual passions, you should train for your own unbinding." Totally penetrated sensual pleasure. So having seen it from within, we spoke earlier about our tendency to think in terms of subject and object. In Buddhist insight, we see that these two are deeply connected. In fact, one of the characteristics of insight is that it sees not only the external appearance, but it also penetrates to the heart, seeing things from within. Having seen things for what they really are, trained for your own unbinding. I love this word. I love this translation, unbinding. It gives a whole new sense to the experience of liberation, doesn't it? This sense of unbinding. The poem continues, be truthful, not insolent, not deceptive, rid of divisiveness. Without anger, the sage should cross over the evil of greed and avarice or hatred. They should conquer laziness, weariness, sloth, and shouldn't consort with heedlessness, and shouldn't stand firm in pride, the person with a heart set on unbinding. They shouldn't engage in lying, shouldn't create a sense of allure in form, should fully fathom conceit, and should live refraining from impulsiveness, shouldn't delight in what's old or prefer what's new. Conceit. In the context of this verse, it's an invitation to recognize our selfing and our tendency to operate from the three complexes of greater, less than, and equal in any given moment. Speaking of old and new, my younger brother and his wife like to visit antique shops. When I visit them, I often go along with them because that's what they do. It's becoming increasingly apparent to me every time I visit a secondhand or antique shop with them. Now, don't get the idea that I go often. I hadn't seen my brother for 6 years. I had a chance to see him about a month ago, so it's not that often. But whenever I go and visit a secondhand or an antique shop with them, it's becoming increasingly apparent that things from my own childhood and early teen years are now being called retro, and in some cases are being called vintage. Soon they'll be called antiques. So in this verse, we hear the phrase, we shouldn't delight in what's old. Old here doesn't mean antiques and so forth, but rather old and new here mean how things were before and how things are now or will be in the future. Don't grieve over the decline or get entangled in what is dazzling and bright. It's easy, particularly when we have physical challenges or chronic illness, to grieve over what in this poem is called the decline. Although in each and every moment there's, as I shared just a few moments ago, there's an arising, there's a remaining for a period of time, and then there's a decline. It can be a decline of a thought, it can be a decline of an experience, it can be a decline in so many ways that things arise, they remain for a while, and then they pass away in a sense. They transform into something else. But for many of us, when we hear the phrase decline, we think about our physical decline, and it's easy if we have physical challenges or a chronic illness to kind of have this sense of grief about what's called the decline. Those with chronic health challenges will know well what I'm speaking about. Our lives can become smaller and smaller in some sense. I myself love swimming. When I was a child, I lived in a beach town where I used to float down the river to the ocean, and then I'd run back and do it again, over and over again. Not so long ago, a few months ago, I had the chance, after a number of years, to visit the village where I grew up, and I did this. It was wonderful. The next morning, I woke up with a fast-moving infection that through the day turned septic, and I needed to quickly travel back to the hospital for treatment. It took a while to resolve that infection, and my immunologist told me that given my immune system, it's probably not a good idea for me to swim in natural bodies of water any longer. So it took me a while to embrace that, because although on one level it's a very small thing, on another level, when one constantly receives messages in which they're asked to, their life becomes a little bit smaller, then it can become a bit dispiriting. But after a couple of days, I thought to myself, right, maybe I can't do that anymore. But there are many things that I still can do, and those things that remain, I'm going to do my best to do them more fully, to enjoy them more fully, and to do them with more love. So additionally, in this verse, I'm reminded of a sign that I saw in Southern California in a strip mall, a small shopping center, that read, "Shiny, pretty things this way." When the Buddha shared what's dazzling and bright, the sign, "Shiny, pretty things this way," came to mind. And this is our usual tendency, to run after what's dazzling and bright. Here in this poem, what's dazzling and bright actually means our entrenchments, the places that we're comfortable, our cravings and our habit energies and so on. They're actually quite comforting. Let's have a sound of the bell. The poem continues, "I call greed a great flood, desire a swift current. Objects of awareness are ripples, sensuality a bog which is hard to cross over. Not deviating from truth, a sage stands on dry ground, a noble one. Having let go of everything, or having let go of the all, they are said to be at peace." The phrase "the all" can be understood with the following passage from the Samyutta Nikaya, which is chapter number 35 and Sutra 23. What is the all? Simply the eye and forms, the ear and sounds, the nose and aromas, the tongue and flavors, the body and tactile sensations, the intellect and ideas. This, friends, is termed the all. So having let go of the all, of having recognized this fact of how we're pulled into all of these different experiences constantly over and over again, then they're said to be at peace. At peace here doesn't just mean a peaceful feeling, as we would tend to interpret this sense of peace nowadays, but it actually means, it's actually referring to peace with a capital P, nirvana, liberation. Having clearly known, the poem continues, having clearly known, this person is an attainer of wisdom. Knowing the Dharma, they're moving rightly through the world. They don't envy anyone here. This is really the aim of the practice, for each of us to know for ourselves the reality of things as they are. This is what's meant by being independent. Who here has crossed over desires, the world's bond so hard to get past? They do not grieve, they do not mourn. The stream is cut, she's all unbound. Again, this image of unbinding, which is a very evocative and beautiful image in the poem. And now we come to a very pithy and emphatic verse. What went before, let go of that. And all that's to come, have none of it. And don't hold on to what's in between, and you'll wander fully at peace. Before, after, and in between is referring to the past, the future, and the present. So everything that went before, let go of that. Everything that is to come, have none of it. And don't hold on to what's in between, and you'll wander fully at peace. For whom there's no I making, all throughout the body and mind, and who doesn't grieve for what is not is undefeated in the world. The first 3 lines of this verse also appear in another text in the Pali Canon, which is also a very early text, the Dhammapada, which contains a number of essential and core teachings of the Buddha in very pithy form, similar to the Atthakavagga. For whom there is no "this is mine," nor anything like "that is theirs," not even finding selfness, they don't grieve at "I have nothing." Not harsh, not greedy, not perturbed, everywhere in tune. This is the reward, I say when asked, for those who are free from preconceptions. In tune. You'll remember that back in the second talk in this series, I spoke of Venerable Sona, the stringed instrument player who played the Vina before he became a monastic. And he was having some issues with his practice. He was practicing a little too severely. And the Buddha invited him to tune his practice up and down in the same way that he would tune the Vina, tune a stringed instrument. In each moment, whatever experience one is having, to tune up or to tune down our attention, to tune our practice to the moment and to pick up the theme. So, free from preconceptions in this verse means not caught up in concepts. In Zen, we call this beginner's mind, to have the mind in which every breath is a new breath, every step is a new step. To not be caught up in our ideas of something, such as an orchid, for example, and we're caught up in this concept, but to be able to always approach it in a new way. To be able to look deeply and touch something new each time we encounter it. For one unperturbed who knows there's no accumulating, abstaining, they everywhere see security. Security here is liberation or unbinding or freedom. That's what's meant by the word security. The sage doesn't speak of themselves as among those who are higher, equal, or lower, at peace, free of selfishness. They don't embrace, they don't reject, the Blessed One said. They don't pull anything, ideas, people, situations towards them, holding on to them and defining ourselves by them, and at the same time not pushing these same things away and rejecting them. This is an incredibly rich and powerful poem. It's a very beautiful one. I hope you've enjoyed going through it very briefly this evening, just as a little taste of some of the key themes that are in this poem. This week it might be helpful for each one of us to reflect on what we might be drawing to ourselves in each and every moment, and what we might be pushing away, if that's the case, what we might be not looking at in each and every moment. So I offer that as a concrete way to be able to look at and apply one of the key themes in this week's poem. I hope you have a wonderful week and you've enjoyed tonight's talk. We'll end with the sound of the bell.